In the heavy silence of a night watch, the icy air cut through the corridors of a maximum security prison. A police dog, trained for detection and control, remained fixed in front of a rusted door, never moving away. Veteran guards would warn, "The rookies, don't bother pulling, he won't leave that spot." Without barking, without movement, the animal simply occupied that point, like a motionless sentinel. In the late hours, the metallic sound of the wind seemed to respond to its attentive body, as if there were a hidden call. In the distance, footsteps echoed through the abandoned block, while the rest of the prison followed its blind routine. An alert was given to transfer him, but the dog resisted, growling against his own collar, and as the key turned in the old lock, the silence of the place became unbearable. What was behind that door? No one could say. Do you love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now back to our story. Jake Sullivan had been working at Millbrook Maximum Security Penitentiary for over 15 years, and in all that time, he had never seen anything quite like this. The morning shift had begun like any other in the sprawling concrete fortress that housed Ohio's most dangerous criminals, but as he made his rounds through Block D, the sight that greeted him was both familiar and deeply unsettling. Max, the German Shepherd, who had served as the prison's most reliable detection dog for the past 3 years, sat motionless in front of cell 47, the same position he had maintained for the last 6 months. His dark eyes were fixed on the rusted iron door, ears perked forward as if listening to something only he could hear. The cell had been officially abandoned for over a decade, yet Max treated it like the most important post in the entire facility. "Still at it, huh, boy?" Jake murmured, approaching the dog with the same mixture of concern and confusion that had plagued him since this bizarre behavior began. Max's tail gave the slightest twitch of acknowledgement, but his gaze never wavered from the door. Sarah Mitchell, barely 2 months into her job as a corrections officer, appeared at the end of the corridor. Her footsteps echoed against the concrete walls as she approached, clipboard in hand and a puzzled expression on her young face. "Morning, Jake. He's still there?" she asked, though the question was more of a statement. Everyone at Millbrook had grown accustomed to Max's inexplicable vigil. "Been here since my last round at midnight," Jake replied, running a weathered hand through his graying hair. "Rodriguez tried to get him to move during the night shift, but you know how that goes." Sarah nodded. She had heard the stories. Max, normally the most obedient and responsive dog in the K9 unit, simply refused to budge from this spot. Treats, commands, even his favorite squeaky toy, nothing could lure him away. The only time he left was for his basic needs, and even then he would rush back as if abandoning some critical mission. "What do you think is in there?" Sarah asked, lowering her voice instinctively. The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Jake shrugged, but his eyes held a weight that suggested he had been asking himself the same question for months. According to the records, nothing. Cell's been empty since 2010. Before that, it housed a few inmates over the years, but nothing special. Nothing that would explain... He gestured toward Max, who remained steadfast in his position. The morning routine continued around them. Inmates shuffled past in their orange jumpsuits, some casting curious glances at the dog, others deliberately, avoiding eye contact. The guards had learned to work around Max's presence, treating him like a piece of immovable furniture that happened to breathe and occasionally shift positions. Warden Thompson, a stern man in his late 50s with steel gray hair and eyes to match, emerged from the administrative wing. His polished shoes clicked against the floor as he approached, his expression one of barely contained frustration. "Sullivan, Mitchell," he nodded curtly. "Still dealing with our canine situation, I see." "Yes, sir." Jake responded. Max hasn't moved since yesterday evening. Dr. Peterson from the veterinary service came by last week, said there's nothing physically wrong with him. Healthiest dog he's ever examined, actually. Thompson's jaw tightened. He had been fielding questions from supervisors, board members, and even media representatives who had caught wind of the story. A dog obsessed with an empty prison cell made for interesting headlines, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about the facility's security protocols and operational efficiency. Have we considered transferring him to another unit? The warden asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. We've tried, sir, Sarah interjected, consulting her notes. Last month, when we attempted to load him into the transport van, he became difficult, wouldn't enter the vehicle, showed signs of distress. The K9 handler said he'd never seen Max react that way to anything. Thompson studied the dog, who seemed completely unbothered by the human conversation taking place around him. Max's ears twitched occasionally, and his nostrils flared as if processing scents that no human could detect. What about the cell itself? Have we conducted a thorough inspection? Jake exchanged a glance with Sarah. We opened it about 4 months ago, sir. Found exactly what the records indicated. Empty space, some old water damage, accumulated dust. Nothing that would interest a dog. Yet here he sits, Thompson muttered, his frustration evident. As if responding to the conversation about him, Max suddenly lifted his head and let out a low whine. The sound was different from his usual vocalizations, more urgent, almost mournful. The three humans fell silent, watching as the dog's posture shifted slightly. His muscles tensed, and for a moment it seemed as though he might stand and finally abandon his post. Instead, Max settled back into his familiar position, but his ears remained alert, swiveling like radar dishes picking up distant signals. Sir, Sarah said hesitantly, some of the other officers have mentioned that Max seems more active during certain times, usually late at night, around 11 or midnight. Officer Rodriguez reported that last Tuesday, Max was actually barking at the door for about 10 minutes. Thompson raised an eyebrow. Barking? At an empty cell? That's what the report says. Rodriguez tried to quiet him, but Max kept it up, until suddenly stopping. Just like that. Sarah snapped her fingers for emphasis. Jake nodded in confirmation. I've noticed the pattern too. During the day, he's calm like this. But at night, especially during the late shift, he gets more agitated. Almost like he's responding to something. Something we can't see or hear, Thompson said slowly, his skepticism warring with the undeniable evidence before them. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Officer Rodriguez, a compact man with kind eyes and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. He carried a steaming cup of coffee and wore the slightly haggard look of someone finishing a long night shift. Morning, everyone, he greeted them, taking a sip of his coffee. Our friend still keeping watch? Rodriguez, Thompson addressed him directly. I understand you've had some interesting experiences with Max during your night rounds. The officer's expression grew more serious. Yes, sir. It's been unusual. The dog's behavior changes after about 10 p.m. He becomes restless, pacing back and forth in front of the cell. And the barking episodes, they're not random. They happen at specific times, almost like clockwork. What do you mean, clockwork? Jake asked, his interest piqued. Well, it's hard to explain exactly, but it's like he's responding to a schedule. The first bark usually happens around 11:15 p.m., then again around 11:45, and sometimes a third time just after midnight. Each session lasts about the same amount of time. Sarah made a note on her clipboard. Have you noticed any external triggers? Sounds from other parts of the facility, changes in temperature, anything that might explain the timing? Rodriguez shook his head. That's what makes it so strange. Those times are usually the quietest of my shift. Most inmates are asleep, minimal foot traffic, no scheduled activities. It's like Max is responding to something that exists on a completely different schedule from the rest of the prison. Thompson absorbed this information, his expression growing, more troubled. And you're certain the cell is empty? No possibility of animals getting in through ventilation, plumbing issues, anything like that? We've checked everything, sir, Jake assured him. Maintenance went through the entire cell last month. No signs of rodents, no structural problems, no hidden compartments or damaged walls. It's just an empty room. Max chose that moment to shift his position, turning his head slightly to look directly at the assembled humans. His dark eyes seemed to hold a depth of knowledge that was almost unsettling. For a brief moment, each person felt as though the dog was trying to communicate something vital, something they weren't equipped to understand. "There's something else," Rodriguez said quietly. "I probably should have mentioned it sooner, but I didn't want to sound crazy. Sometimes, when Max is having one of his barking episodes, I get this feeling like I'm not alone, like there's someone else in the corridor with me, but when I turn around, there's nothing there." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "You mean like another person? I can't explain it properly. It's just a presence, a sense that someone or something is watching. It only happens when Max is agitated, and it always seems to be coming from the direction of cell 47. The group fell silent, each processing this new information in their own way. Jake found himself staring at the cell door, wondering what secrets might lie behind the rusted metal. Sarah unconsciously stepped closer to the older officer, seeking comfort in his experience and steady presence. Thompson's analytical mind raced through possible explanations, none of them entirely satisfactory. Max remained unmoved by the human speculations swirling around him. His duty, whatever it might be, continued unchanged. The morning sun streamed through the high windows of Block D, casting long shadows across the concrete floor, but the dog's vigil persisted, as constant and mysterious as ever. As the day shift settled into its routine, each person carried with them a growing sense that Max's behavior was more than just an animal's inexplicable fixation. Something was drawing the German Shepherd to cell 47, something that existed beyond the realm of normal explanation, and with each passing day, the mystery only seemed to deepen. 2 weeks had passed since the conversation in Block D, and the situation with Max had evolved from curious to genuinely concerning. Sarah Mitchell found herself volunteering for night shifts more frequently, driven by a growing fascination with the German Shepherd's mysterious behavior. What she discovered during those long, quiet hours challenged everything she thought she understood about the routine operations of Millbrook Penitentiary. It was 10:47 p.m. on a Tuesday when Sarah first witnessed the transformation firsthand. She had been making her rounds through the cell blocks, her footsteps echoing in the dimly lit corridors. As she approached Block D, she could see Max's silhouette in the distance, still maintaining his vigil at cell 47. But as she drew closer, she noticed something different about his posture. The dog was no longer sitting calmly. Instead, he paced back and forth in front of the cell door, his movements precise and measured, like a soldier walking his post. His ears were erect, constantly swiveling to catch sounds that remained inaudible to human ears. Occasionally, he would stop directly in front of the door and tilt his head, as if listening to a conversation taking place on the other side. "Easy, boy," Sarah whispered as she approached, not wanting to startle him. Max acknowledged her presence with a brief glance, but immediately returned his attention to the cell. At exactly 11:15 p.m., just as Rodriguez had described, Max began to bark. But these weren't the random barks of an agitated animal. The sounds were measured, almost rhythmic, as if he were responding to something specific. Sarah counted 12 distinct barks before Max fell silent, his breathing slightly labored from the exertion. During the silence that followed, Sarah found herself straining to hear any sound that might have triggered the dog's response. The prison was quieter than usual. No conversations from distant cells, no footsteps from other corridors, even the usual mechanical hums of the ventilation system seemed muted. Yet Max remained alert, his entire body tense with anticipation. The second barking episode occurred at 11:43 p.m., lasting exactly as long as the first. This time, Sarah noticed something that made her skin crawl. During the brief pauses between Max's barks, she could swear she heard something else, not quite an echo, but a sound that seemed to come from within the cell itself. It was too faint to identify, but it had a quality that suggested response rather than coincidence. She pulled out her phone and began recording, hoping to capture whatever Max was reacting to. The device's microphone was more sensitive than her ears, and she thought it might pick up sounds she couldn't detect. As she held the phone toward the cell door, Max turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the dim corridor, lighting in a way that seemed almost knowing. The third barking episode never came that night. Instead, at 12:05 a.m., Max simply lay down in front of the cell door and closed his eyes as if his shift had officially ended. Sarah remained for another hour, watching the sleeping dog and trying to process what she had witnessed. The next morning, Jake found her in the break room, staring at her phone with bloodshot eyes and a cup of cold coffee. "Rough night?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. "I recorded Max last night during his barking episodes," Sarah said without looking up. "Jake, you need to hear this." She played back the recording and both officers leaned in to listen. Max's barks came through clearly, but in the background, almost hidden beneath the dog's vocalizations, there were other sounds. Faint scratching noises, like fingernails against metal, and what sounded like whispered words, too distorted to understand, but unmistakably human in origin. Jake's face grew pale. "Where did these sounds come from?" "That's just it," Sarah replied, her voice shaky. "They're coming from inside cell 47. I held the phone right up to the door during the recording." But the cell is empty." "We checked it ourselves." "I know what we found, Jake. I also know what I'm hearing on this recording." Word of Sarah's recording spread quickly through the prison staff. By afternoon, Warden Thompson had assembled a small team to investigate further. Along with Jake and Sarah, he brought in Dr. Marcus Webb, the facility's chief psychologist, and Tom Harrison, the head of maintenance. "Before we jump to any conclusions," Thompson began as they stood before cell 47, "I want us to approach this systematically. Dr. Webb, what's your assessment of Max's behavior from a psychological standpoint?" Dr. Webb, a thoughtful man in his early 40s with wire-rimmed glasses, observed the German Shepherd for several minutes before responding. "Dogs are incredibly sensitive to environmental cues that humans often miss. Changes in air pressure, ultrasonic sounds, chemical signatures in the air. They process information on levels we can barely comprehend. However, Max's behavior suggests something more complex than simple environmental sensitivity." "Meaning what, exactly?" Thompson asked. "The ritualistic nature of his response, the specific timing, the apparent communication pattern. These behaviors suggest Max is interacting with something, not just reacting to it. In my opinion, he's not responding to random stimuli. He's engaged in some form of dialogue." Harrison, a practical man who had maintained the prison's infrastructure for over a decade, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Doc, dogs don't have conversations with empty rooms. There has to be a rational explanation. Maybe we missed something in our initial inspection." "Then let's look again," Thompson decided. "Harrison, I want you to bring Your most thorough equipment. Check every inch of that cell, walls, floor, ceiling, everything. As Harrison unlocked the heavy door, Max immediately stood and pushed forward, trying to enter the cell ahead of the humans. Jake had to restrain him, noting how the dog's entire demeanor changed when the door opened. His tail wagged furiously, and he whined with an urgency that bordered on desperation. The cell was exactly as they had left it months ago, a small rectangular room with concrete walls, a single barred window near the ceiling, and a metal cot bolted to one wall. Water stains marked the corners where decades of moisture had seeped through the aging structure, and dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. Harrison began his examination with electronic equipment designed to detect structural anomalies. His scanning device beeped rhythmically as he ran it along the walls, searching for hollow spaces or hidden compartments. For the first hour, the scan revealed nothing unusual. "Wait," Harrison said suddenly, stopping near the back wall of the cell. "I'm getting a different reading here." The others crowded around as he examined a section of wall that appeared identical to the rest. His scanner indicated a slight variation in density, suggesting that something might be concealed behind the concrete. "Could be old plumbing or electrical conduit," Harrison mused, "but the pattern is unusual. It's like there's a rectangular space back there, maybe 3 feet wide and 6 feet tall." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. A space large enough for a person? Theoretically, yes. But access would require breaking through this wall, and there's no visible evidence that it's ever been disturbed. Dr. Webb had been observing Max during the examination. The dog had settled near the suspect wall, his behavior markedly different from his usual vigilant posture. Instead of facing outward toward the cell door, Max lay with his nose pressed against the concrete, occasionally making soft whimpering sounds. "His behavior has changed completely now that he's inside the cell," Dr. Webb noted. "Outside, he was guarding. In here, he's mourning." The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Thompson felt a chill despite the warm afternoon air circulating through the prison. "Mourning what?" Sarah asked quietly. Before Dr. Webb could respond, Max suddenly stood and began pawing at the base of the wall where Harrison's scanner had detected the anomaly. His claws scraped against the concrete with increasing intensity, and he began to whine with a sound that was almost human in its expression of loss and longing. "Stop him before he hurts himself," Thompson ordered, but as Jake moved to restrain the dog, Harrison held up a hand. "Wait, look at this." He knelt beside Max and examined the area where the dog was scratching. "These aren't old water stains. These are scratches in the concrete, and they're relatively recent." The scratches formed crude but unmistakable patterns, letters and symbols carved into the hard surface. Most were too weathered or incomplete to decipher, but one word stood out clearly: help. Sarah gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. The implications of the discovery sent shockwaves through the small group. "This changes everything," Thompson said grimly. "If someone was able to scratch messages into this wall, they had to have been in this cell much more recently than our records indicate." Harrison continued his examination of the scratches, using a magnifying glass to study the markings more closely. "Based on the depth and the way the concrete has aged around these marks, I'd estimate they were made within the last 5 to 10 years. Definitely not decades old." "But our records show this cell has been empty since 2010, Jake protested. "Then our records are wrong," Thompson replied. "The question is whether this was an administrative error or something more deliberate." Dr. Webb had remained quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up, Warden, I think we need to consider the possibility that Max isn't just responding to environmental cues. He might be responding to human distress that occurred in this location. You mean emotional residue? Sarah asked. I mean trauma. Severe emotional distress can leave impressions in environments where it occurred. Some animals are particularly sensitive to these impressions, especially if they involve fear, pain, or calls for help. Thompson absorbed this information, his expression growing more troubled by the minute. Dr. Webb, are you suggesting that Max is responding to something that happened to a person who was kept in this cell? I'm suggesting that Max's behavior indicates someone was in significant distress in this location, and that distress was recent enough to still register on whatever sensory levels Max operates on. As if to underscore the psychologist's words, Max suddenly let out a long, mournful howl that echoed through the empty cell and down the corridor beyond. The sound raised goosebumps on everyone's arms and seemed to carry with it all the anguish and desperation that the crude scratches in the wall could only begin to express. The investigation had taken an unexpected and deeply unsettling turn, and everyone present understood that they were no longer dealing with a simple case of unusual animal behavior. They were uncovering evidence of human suffering that had been carefully hidden, and Max had somehow become the guardian of secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to bury. The discovery of fresh scratches in Cell 47 prompted Warden Thompson to authorize a comprehensive investigation into the prison's records. Sarah volunteered to spend her off-duty hours in the archives, determined to uncover any inconsistencies that might explain Max's behavior and the evidence they had found. The Millbrook Archives occupied a basement level of the administrative building, a windowless maze of filing cabinets and storage boxes that contained decades of institutional memory. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah navigated between towering shelves of documents, searching for anything related to Cell 47 or Block D during the period when the scratches might have been made. Jake joined her on the third day of searching, bringing coffee and a fresh perspective to the daunting task. Together, they methodically worked through intake records, transfer documents, disciplinary reports, and maintenance logs, looking for any mention of unauthorized cell occupancy or unexplained activity in the supposedly abandoned section of the prison. Here's something interesting, Jake said, pulling a thin folder from a box marked Disciplinary Actions 2012-2015. Look at this incident report from 2013. Sarah leaned over to read the document. It described a physical altercation between two inmates in the recreation yard, but what caught their attention was a handwritten note in the margin. Recommend isolation in D block pending investigation, D. Morrison. D. Morrison, Sarah repeated. Wasn't he assistant warden back then? Before my time, but I think so. The question is, which cell in D block was used for isolation? And why isn't there a record of the inmate being placed there? They continued searching and found 3 more similar references over the next 2 hours, disciplinary cases where Morrison had recommended isolation in D block, but no corresponding records showed where the inmates had actually been housed during their punishment. This is starting to look like a pattern, Sarah observed. Morrison was using D block for unauthorized isolation, but he wasn't documenting it properly. Jake found another piece of the puzzle in a box of personnel files. David Morrison had been dismissed from his position in 2015 following an internal investigation into irregularities in prisoner management procedures. The details of the investigation had been sealed, but the termination was immediate and he had been escorted from the premises. We need to find Morrison, Jake declared. If he was running some kind of off-the-books operation in D block, he might know what happened in Cell 47. Meanwhile, Tom Harrison had been conducting his own investigation into the structural anomaly behind the cell wall. Using more sophisticated equipment borrowed from a local construction company, he had confirmed the presence of a hidden space, approximately 6 feet tall and 3 feet deep. Ground-penetrating radar revealed that the space had been sealed with concrete, but the construction was noticeably different from the original prison walls. This was definitely added later, Harrison explained to Thompson during their morning briefing. The concrete composition is different, and the construction technique doesn't match the prison's original specifications. Someone walled up this space sometime after the prison was built. Dr. Webb had continued monitoring Max's behavior and made his own disturbing discovery. The German Shepherd's health was beginning to decline. He was eating less, sleeping poorly, and showed signs of chronic stress that were affecting his physical condition. It's as if he's carrying a psychological burden, Dr. Webb explained to the assembled team. Dogs are incredibly empathetic animals, and Max seems to be absorbing and reflecting emotional trauma that occurred in that location. If we don't resolve this situation soon, I'm concerned about his long-term well-being. Thompson made a decision that would prove crucial to unraveling the mystery. Harrison, I want you to carefully open that wall. If there's a hidden space behind, Cell 47, we need to know what's in it. Sarah, Jake, continue searching for David Morrison. We need to hear his side of this story. The search for Morrison proved easier than expected. Sarah found his current address through the state's professional licensing database. He had moved to Cleveland and was working as a security consultant for private businesses. More importantly, he had a listed phone number. Jake made the call, identifying himself as a corrections officer at Millbrook and explaining that they needed to speak with Morrison about his time at the prison. Morrison's initial response was defensive and evasive, but when Jake mentioned Cell 47 specifically, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. I can't discuss that over the phone, Morrison finally said. If you're serious about this, meet me tomorrow evening at Murphy's Diner on Highway 71, outside Columbus. Come alone and don't bring any recording devices. The clandestine nature of the meeting arrangement only heightened everyone's sense that they were uncovering something significant. Thompson decided that Jake should make the trip, given his experience and his rapport with Morrison during the phone conversation. While Jake prepared for his meeting with Morrison, Harrison began the delicate process of opening the sealed wall. In Cell 47, using specialized tools designed to minimize damage to the surrounding structure, he carefully removed sections of the newer concrete, revealing the hidden space inch by inch. Max became increasingly agitated as the work progressed. The German Shepherd paced frantically around the work area, whining and occasionally barking at the emerging opening. Sarah stayed with him, trying to provide comfort, but noticed that his behavior was different from his previous patterns, more urgent, more desperate, as if he sensed that long-buried secrets were finally coming to light. As Harrison worked, Sarah noticed something else that chilled her to the bone. The air coming from the hidden space had a distinct smell, not the musty odor of old construction materials, but something organic and unsettling. It reminded her of the smell that lingered in hospital rooms where people had endured prolonged suffering. "Tom, stop for a minute," Sarah called out. "Do you smell that?" Harrison paused his work and took a deep breath. His expression immediately changed. "That's not normal. That's not construction materials or water damage." Dr. Webb, who had been observing from the corridor, stepped closer to the opening. As a psychologist who had worked in institutional settings for years, he had encountered many unpleasant odors associated with human distress and confinement. This smell triggered recognition that made him deeply uncomfortable. "Gentlemen, I think we need to proceed very carefully," he said quietly. "Whatever is in that space, It's been sealed for years, and the conditions inside may be hazardous. Harrison nodded and put on protective gear before continuing. As he removed more concrete, the opening grew large enough to shine a flashlight inside. What they saw made everyone step back in shock. The hidden space contained personal belongings, clothes, shoes, a worn paperback book, and what appeared to be a small journal. But more disturbing were the scratches covering every inch of the interior walls. Unlike the few marks they had found on the outer wall of cell 47, these scratches formed a comprehensive record of someone's desperate attempts to communicate with the outside world. "Dear God," Thompson whispered as he examined the scratches with Harrison's flashlight. Someone was kept in there. The scratches told a story of isolation, fear, and gradual despair. Names were carved into the walls. Some crossed out, others circled repeatedly. Dates had been meticulously marked, suggesting that whoever had been confined there had tried to keep track of time. Most heartbreaking were the messages clearly intended for family members, declarations of love and pleas for forgiveness that would never be delivered. Sarah carefully retrieved the journal, using gloves, her hands shaking as she opened the small notebook. The first entry was dated March 15, 2013, and was written in careful handwriting that gradually became more erratic as the entries progressed. "They say I attacked another inmate, but I was defending myself," the first entry read. "Morrison says, this is just temporary until things cool down, but something about this place feels wrong. The other guards don't seem to know I'm here." As Sarah read further, a disturbing picture emerged. The journal's author, who identified himself as Danny Brooks, described being placed in the hidden cell as punishment for the altercation Jake and Sarah had found in the disciplinary files. But instead of the standard isolation period, Brooks had been kept in the secret space for weeks, then months. "Morrison visits every few days," one entry read. "He says the investigation is still ongoing, that I can't be returned to general population yet, but I can hear other inmates in the regular cells, and they don't sound like they're under investigation. I think something else is happening here." Entries became increasingly desperate as Brooks realized that his confinement was not following normal procedures. He described attempts to signal his presence to other guards, his growing weakness from inadequate food and medical care, and his mounting fear that he had been forgotten by the system. "I scratch messages on the walls hoping someone will find them," one later entry read. "If something happens to me, I want people to know I was here. My sister Jennifer in Toledo needs to know what happened. Morrison promised to contact her, but I don't think he ever did." The final entries were barely legible, written by someone who was clearly struggling with both physical weakness and psychological distress. The last entry was dated September 3, 2013, and consisted of only 2 words repeated multiple times. "Help me." Dr. Webb examined the journal with growing horror. This describes systematic psychological torture. Brooks was deliberately isolated and forgotten, kept alive but denied human contact and proper care for months. "But what happened to him?" Sarah asked. "How did he get out of there? And why is there no record of his release or transfer?" The answer to those questions would have to wait for Jake's meeting with David Morrison. As the team stood in the oppressive atmosphere of the revealed space, Max finally settled down, lying peacefully for the first time in months. It was as if the opening of Danny Brooks' hidden prison had released something that had been holding the dog captive to his vigil. The German Shepherd's relief was palpable, but for the humans involved in the discovery, the real work was just beginning. They had uncovered evidence of a serious crime that had been concealed for over a decade, and they needed answers about what had ultimately happened to Danny Brooks and why David Morrison had gone to such lengths to hide his imprisonment. The investigation had evolved from a curious case of animal behavior to something far more serious, and everyone involved understood that they were now dealing with potential criminal charges and a cover-up that reached into the highest levels of the prison's former administration. Murphy's Diner sat like a beacon of warm light against the darkening Ohio highway, its neon sign flickering intermittently in the evening drizzle. Jake Sullivan arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a corner booth that gave him a clear view of both the entrance and the parking lot. His years in corrections had taught him the value of being aware of his surroundings, especially when meeting someone who might have information about illegal activities. David Morrison arrived precisely on time, and Jake recognized him immediately, despite the years that had passed since his dismissal from Millbrook. Morrison had aged considerably. His once dark hair was now completely grey, and deep lines etched his face like a map of accumulated stress and guilt. He moved with the careful gait of someone carrying invisible burdens. Morrison slid into the booth across from Jake without offering a handshake, his eyes constantly scanning the diner as if expecting to be watched or followed. The waitress approached, and both men ordered coffee, using the brief interaction to size each other up. "You said this was about cell 47, Morrison began once they were alone. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't used it much in recent years. "I haven't heard that designation mentioned in a long time. We found some things," Jake said carefully. "Things that suggest the cell wasn't as empty as our records indicate." Morrison's hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if seeking warmth, though the diner was comfortably heated. "What kind of things?" Jake had prepared for this conversation by deciding on a strategy of gradual revelation. He needed Morrison to trust him enough to reveal the truth, but he also needed to gauge the former assistant warden's level of involvement in whatever had happened. Scratches on the walls, recent ones, and a dog that won't leave the cell alone. Hasn't for months. It's like he's guarding something or someone. Morrison's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face went pale, and he set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. "Max? The German Shepherd is still doing that?" The fact that Morrison knew Max's name and his specific behavior told Jake everything he needed to know about the former administrator's level of involvement. "So, you know why he's there?" "I hoped he would forget," Morrison whispered, staring into his coffee. "Dogs are supposed to have short memories, aren't they? I thought after enough time passed, he would move on to other duties." "Morrison, we found the hidden space behind the cell. We found Danny Brooks's journal." The name hit Morrison like a physical blow. He hunched forward, covering his face with his hands, and for several moments the only sound between them was the distant clatter of dishes from the diner's kitchen. "How much do you know?" Morrison finally asked. "We know Brooks was placed in unauthorized isolation in 2013. We know he was kept there for months without proper documentation. We know he was asking for help and trying to contact his family. What we don't know is what happened to him after September 2013, and we don't know why." Morrison was silent for so long that Jake began to wonder if he would speak at all. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and haunted. "Danny Brooks was a good kid who got caught up in something bigger than himself," Morrison began. "The altercation in the recreation yard, that wasn't random violence. Brooks had stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see, and there were people who wanted him silenced." "What did he see?" "Contraband operations, not the usual drugs, or weapons that inmates try to smuggle in. This was bigger, systematic corruption involving staff members, outside contractors, even some community officials. Brooks worked in the laundry, and he had access to areas where he could observe. Things others missed? Jake leaned forward, his training telling him to let Morrison talk without interruption. The former assistant warden seemed to be unburdening himself of secrets he had carried for years. The altercation was staged to give us a reason to isolate Brooks, to keep him quiet while we figured out how to handle the situation. The plan was supposed to be temporary, a few days, maybe a week, but the people involved in the corruption had too much to lose. Who were these people? Morrison shook his head. Some are gone now, transferred or retired. Others are still in positions of authority. I can't give you names without proof, and the proof was destroyed years ago. So you built the hidden cell to keep Brooks quiet. I built it to keep him alive, Morrison said sharply. There were discussions about permanent solutions to the Brooks problem. Inmates disappear sometimes, transferred to other facilities, released early for cooperation. Sometimes they just vanish into the system. I thought if I could keep him hidden and safe, I could eventually find a way to resolve the situation without anyone getting hurt. Jake felt a chill as the implications of Morrison's words sank in. You're saying people wanted Brooks eliminated. I'm saying that a lot of money was involved, and desperate people make extreme decisions. The hidden cell was supposed to be protection, not imprisonment. But it became imprisonment. Brooks's journal describes months of isolation, inadequate. No food, no medical care, no contact with his family. Morrison's shoulders sagged, as if the weight of Jake's words was physically crushing him. I know what it became. I visited him regularly, tried to explain that it was for his own safety, that we were working on a solution. But weeks turned into months, and the people involved in the corruption began pressuring me to find a more permanent solution. What happened in September 2013? Why do his journal entries stop? The question Morrison had been dreading hung between them like a sword. He stared out the diner window at the passing traffic, gathering courage for what Jake sensed would be the most difficult part of his confession. Brooks got sick, Morrison said finally. The conditions in the hidden cell, the stress, the isolation. His health started deteriorating rapidly. I wanted to move him to the medical wing, but the people calling the shots said it was too risky. They said if Brooks went to medical, he might talk to staff who weren't part of the cover-up. So what did you do? I tried to treat him myself, brought him antibiotics, tried to improve his living conditions, spent more time with him to combat the psychological effects of isolation. But I'm not a doctor, and Brooks needed real medical attention. Jake waited, sensing that Morrison was building up to the crucial revelation. On September 7th, I found Brooks unconscious. He was burning with fever, barely breathing. I made a decision that I've regretted every day since. Morrison's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I moved him out of the prison. You helped him escape. I saved his life, Morrison corrected. I had a contact at a private medical facility in Pennsylvania, someone who owed me a favor and could provide treatment without asking questions. I sedated Brooks, put him in my personal vehicle, and drove him there myself. The revelation hung in the air as Jake processed its implications. Brooks is alive. He was when I left him at the medical facility. The doctor there stabilized his condition and agreed to keep his treatment confidential. I gave Brooks some cash and told him to disappear, to start over somewhere far from Ohio and never contact anyone from his previous life. Jake felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that Danny Brooks had apparently survived his ordeal, but anger at the systematic abuse and cover-up that had made his disappearance necessary. Why didn't you report the corruption? Why go through all this instead of involving the authorities? Morrison laughed bitterly, because the corruption went all the way up. The state officials who would have investigated the case were part of the problem. The contractors involved had political connections. The whole system was compromised. And Max, how does the dog fit into this? Max was assigned to Brooks during his legitimate isolation period before I moved him to the hidden cell. Dogs form attachments, especially to people under stress. Max somehow understood that Brooks was in distress, and he never stopped looking for him. Even after I moved Brooks to the medical facility, Max kept returning to cell 47 as if he was waiting for Brooks to come back. So Max has been guarding Brooks' memory all this time? Max has been keeping faith with someone who needed protection, Morrison said. That dog understood loyalty better than most of the humans involved in this situation. Jake sat back, overwhelmed by the scope of what Morrison had revealed. Why are you telling me this now? Why not years ago? Because I've been living with the guilt of what I did and what I didn't do. When you called and mentioned cell 47 and the dog, I realized that some secrets can't stay buried forever. And because Danny Brooks deserves to have his story told, even if I can't undo the harm that was done to him. Morrison reached into his jacket and pulled out a small key. This opens a storage unit in Akron, Unit 247. Inside, you'll find documents I kept, evidence of the corruption, names of the people involved, financial records. Everything I should have turned over to investigators years ago. Jake took the key, understanding the significance of what Morrison was entrusting to him. What happens now? Now you decide what to do with the truth, Morrison replied. You can expose the corruption and clear Danny Brooks' name, but you'll be taking on powerful people who thought this was all buried permanently. Or you can let sleeping dogs lie, so to speak, and let Max continue his vigil in peace. As Morrison stood to leave, Jake had one final question. Do you know where Brooks is now? Is he still alive? Morrison paused at the edge of the booth. I don't know. I haven't had any contact with him since that night in 2013. For his safety and mine, it had to be a complete break. But I hope he found a way to build a new life, somewhere far from the people who wanted to silence him. Morrison walked away, leaving Jake alone with his coffee and the weight of revelations that would change everything about the mysterious vigil at Millbrook Penitentiary. The key to the storage unit felt heavy in his hand, representing not just evidence of past crimes, but the responsibility to decide how much of the truth should be revealed and to whom. Outside the diner, the evening rain continued to fall, washing the highways clean while inside. Jake contemplated the complexity of justice and the price of keeping dangerous secrets buried in the shadows of institutional power. Jake's drive back to Millbrook through the rain-soaked Ohio countryside gave him time to process Morrison's revelations, but no clarity about what course of action to take. The key to Storage Unit 247 seemed to burn in his pocket, representing evidence that could expose corruption at the highest levels of the state correction system, while potentially destroying careers and lives in the process. He arrived at the prison just as the morning shift was beginning, finding Sarah, Thompson, and Dr. Webb gathered in the administrative conference room. Max lay peacefully near the door, the first time in months that the German Shepherd had left his post at cell 47 voluntarily. Well? Thompson asked as Jake settled into a chair, exhaustion clear on his weathered features. Jake spent the next hour recounting his conversation with Morrison, watching as shock, anger, and disbelief played across his colleagues' faces. When he finished with Morrison's confession about moving Brooks to a medical facility, the room fell into stunned silence. So Danny Brooks is potentially still alive, Sarah said finally, and Max has been guarding his memory all this time. It explains everything, Dr. Webb added quietly. Max's behavior, the timing of his agitation, even his reluctance to leave the area. Dogs have an extraordinary capacity for loyalty and memory. He was maintaining faith with someone he perceived as needing protection. Thompson leaned back in his chair, the implications of Jake's report clearly weighing heavily on him. And Morrison gave you evidence of the corruption? Jake produced the key. He says there are documents in a storage unit that prove everything, names, financial records, the whole operation. But he also warned me that some of the people involved are still in positions of power. We have to report this, Sarah said immediately. Danny Brooks was illegally imprisoned for months. Even if Morrison thought he was protecting him, what happened was criminal. But to whom do we report it? Thompson asked pragmatically. If Morrison is right about the scope of the corruption, we could be handing evidence over to the very people who covered it up in the first place. Dr. Webb had been quietly observing Max during the conversation. There's something else to consider. Max's behavior has completely changed since we opened the hidden space. He's eating normally, sleeping peacefully, and responding to commands like his old self. In psychological terms, he's experienced resolution. What do you mean? Jake asked. Max somehow understood that his vigil was successful. By leading us to the evidence of Brooks' imprisonment, he fulfilled whatever psychological contract he had made with himself. His work was complete. The discussion was interrupted by a knock on the conference room door. Tom Harrison entered, carrying a manila folder and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. I hope I'm not interrupting, but I think you need to see this immediately, Harrison said, opening the folder to reveal photographs and documents. I spent yesterday analyzing everything we found in the hidden space, and I discovered something remarkable. He spread the photographs across the conference table, showing close-up images of the scratches carved into the walls of Brooks' hidden cell. I thought these were just random marks of desperation, but when I studied them more carefully, I realized they form a pattern. Sarah leaned forward to examine the images. They look like names and dates. They are names and dates, but not just Brooks. Look at this section here. Harrison pointed to a series of scratches in one corner of the hidden space. These marks were made by different tools, probably at different times. I think Brooks wasn't the only person kept in that space. The revelation sent shockwaves through the group. Thompson grabbed one of the photographs, studying it intently. Are you saying other inmates were imprisoned there? That's exactly what I'm saying. Based on the tool marks and the different handwriting styles, I estimate at least 3 different. People carved messages into these walls over a period of several years. Jake felt his stomach clench as he realized the full scope of what they had uncovered. Morrison said Brooks' situation was unique, that he was being protected from people who wanted to silence him. But if other inmates were also held there, then Morrison was running a systematic operation, Thompson finished grimly. Either he was more involved in the corruption than he admitted, or he was using the hidden cell for other purposes entirely. Sarah was studying the photographs with a magnifying glass. Some of these names, they're familiar. I remember processing incident reports that mentioned some of these inmates. They were all listed as transfers to other facilities. Transfers that never actually happened, Harrison added. I cross-referenced the names I could decipher with our database. 3 inmates who supposedly left Millbrook between 2011 and 2014 have no records of arrival at their designated destination facilities. The weight of their discovery was staggering. What had begun as an investigation into unusual dog behavior had uncovered evidence of multiple illegal imprisonments and a cover-up that potentially involved systematic human rights violations. Dr. Webb spoke carefully. We're no longer dealing with a single case of administrative misconduct. This appears to be evidence of multiple crimes committed over several years. Thompson stood and began pacing, his mind working through the implications. We have two choices. We can turn this evidence over to state authorities and hope it reaches someone not involved in the original cover-up, or we can conduct our own investigation to gather more evidence before involving outside agencies. There's a third choice, Jake said quietly. We can try to find Danny Brooks. The room fell silent as everyone processed this suggestion. Sarah was the first to speak. Jake, Morrison said. Brooks disappeared into witness protection, essentially. Even if he's alive, he might not want to be found, and tracking him down could put him in danger from the same people who wanted him silenced originally. But he's the only witness who can testify about what happened, Jake replied. Without his testimony, all we have is circumstantial evidence and Morrison's word against potentially powerful officials. Thompson stopped pacing and looked directly at Jake. What are you proposing? I want to access that storage unit and see what evidence Morrison left behind. If the documents are as comprehensive as he claimed, they might contain information about where Brooks was taken for medical treatment. We could try to trace him from there. Dr. Webb raised a concern that had been nagging at him. We need to consider the psychological impact on Brooks if we do locate him. He escaped from a traumatic situation and has been building a new life for over a decade. Contacting him could reopen psychological wounds that have taken years to heal. But he also deserves to know that his story is finally being told, Sarah countered. He might want the chance to clear his name and see justice done for what happened to him. Harrison had been quiet during this exchange, but now he raised another crucial point. There's something else we need to consider. If we start actively investigating this case, word will get back to the people involved in the original corruption. We could be putting ourselves at risk. The soberness of Harrison's warning settled over the group. They were no longer dealing with historical misconduct, but with potentially dangerous individuals who had committed serious crimes and had reasons to keep their actions hidden. Thompson made a decision that would define their next steps. I'm going to contact Attorney General Patricia Williams directly. She took office after most of this occurred, so she shouldn't be compromised by the original corruption. I'll brief her on what we've found and ask for guidance on how to proceed safely. What about the storage unit? Jake asked. We'll access it together with proper documentation and witnesses. If Morrison left evidence there, it needs to be secured and preserved according to proper legal procedures. Dr. Webb looked down at Max, who had remained peacefully, settled during their intense discussion. What about him? Max has been our guide through this entire investigation. In a way, he deserves to know how his story ends. Sarah smiled sadly. I think he already knows. Look at him. He's finally at peace. Whatever he was waiting for, whatever mission he was on, I think he considers it complete. As if responding to their conversation about him, Max raised his head and looked directly at each person in the room, his dark eyes seeming to convey gratitude. Then he laid his head back down and closed his eyes, the picture of a job well done. The investigation was entering a new phase, one that would require careful coordination with law enforcement and possibly federal authorities. The evidence they had uncovered painted a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond a single case of administrative misconduct. But for the first time since this mystery began, they had hope that justice might finally be served for Danny Brooks and the other victims of the hidden cell. Max's unwavering vigil had led them to truths that powerful people had worked hard to bury, and now those truths demanded action. The key to the storage unit represented more than just evidence. It was the key to potentially reuniting Danny Brooks with the faithful dog who had never stopped looking for him, and to ensuring that the crimes committed in the shadows of Millbrook Penitentiary would finally be brought to light. 3 weeks after their meeting with Attorney General Patricia Williams, Jake found himself standing in the parking lot of a small apartment complex in Portland, Oregon, his heart pounding with anticipation and uncertainty. The investigation that had begun with Max's mysterious vigil had led them across the country and through layers of corruption that reached higher into the state government than anyone had imagined. The evidence in Morrison's storage unit had been comprehensive and damning. Financial records showed kickbacks totaling over $2 million, involving contracts for prison food services, construction projects, and medical supplies. Names of state officials, judges, and business leaders filled page after page of carefully documented transactions. Most importantly, Morrison had kept detailed records of every person who had been held in the hidden cell, including their alleged crimes, the real reasons for their imprisonment, and what had ultimately happened to them. Danny Brooks had been one of 4 inmates subjected to unauthorized imprisonment between 2011 and 2014. The other 3 had been transferred to different states under false identities, their original names expunged from official records to prevent them from ever returning to testify about their experiences. Brooks had been the only one whose medical condition had forced Morrison to take drastic action. Attorney General Williams had moved swiftly once presented with the evidence. 7 arrests had been made, including 2 sitting state legislators and the former director of the Department of Corrections. Morrison had voluntarily surrendered to authorities and was cooperating fully with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence that reflected his ultimate decision to save Brooks's life. The medical facility in Pennsylvania had provided records showing that Brooks had been treated for severe dehydration, malnutrition, and psychological trauma. Upon his recovery, he had been given a new identity and relocated to Oregon through a legitimate witness protection program that Morrison had arranged through federal contacts. Danny Brooks, now known as David Bradley, worked as a maintenance supervisor at a community college and lived alone in a modest apartment. Federal marshals had contacted him 2 weeks earlier to explain that his case was being reopened and that he would be asked to testify about his experiences. His initial reaction had been fear and reluctance, but when told about Max's role in bringing the truth to light, he had agreed to meet with Jake. Sarah stood beside Jake in the parking lot, Max on a leash between them. The German Shepherd seemed to sense the importance of the moment, his entire body alert and focused as they approached the apartment building. They had driven across the country to make this reunion possible, with the blessing of both the Attorney General's office and the federal prosecutors handling the case. Unit 2B, Jake said, checking the address they had been given. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah nodded, though her voice betrayed her emotion. "I just hope Max recognizes him after all these years." They climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor and found the apartment. Jake knocked gently, and after a moment, they heard footsteps approaching from inside. The door opened to reveal a man in his late 30s, with kind eyes and graying temples, his face bearing the subtle marks of someone who had endured significant hardship but found peace on the other side. Danny Brooks, David Bradley, looked exactly as Jake had imagined from reading his journal entries. But it was Max's reaction that confirmed beyond any doubt that they had found the right person. The German Shepherd immediately began whimpering with excitement, his tail wagging with such intensity that his entire body shook. He strained against the leash, every instinct telling him to rush forward to the person he had been waiting for all these years. Danny's eyes filled with tears as he looked down at the dog. "Max, is that really you, boy?" The sound of Danny's voice triggered an immediate response from Max. The dog began barking with joy, the same rhythmic pattern that had echoed through the corridors of Millbrook for months, but now filled with happiness rather than distress. "May we come in?" Jake asked, his own voice thick with emotion at witnessing the reunion. Danny stepped aside, and the moment Sarah released the leash, Max bounded forward and jumped up to place his paws on Danny's chest. The man wrapped his arms around the dog, burying his face in Max's fur as years of suppressed emotion finally found release. "I never forgot you," Danny whispered to Max. "Every day for 10 years, I wondered if you were okay, if you remembered me." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the reunion. "He never forgot you either. He spent 6 months sitting outside your old cell, waiting for you to come back." Danny looked up at Jake and Sarah, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Morrison told me that Max was assigned to watch me during my isolation, but I had no idea he would..." He paused, overcome by emotion. "Max led us to the truth," Jake explained. "His behavior was so unusual that we had to investigate. He's the reason we found the hidden cell, your journal, and eventually all the evidence that brought down the corruption ring." They spent the next hour in Danny's modest living room, Max refusing to leave his side as Danny shared his story of recovery and rebuilding. The trauma of his imprisonment had taken years to overcome, even with professional counseling and the support of the Witness Protection Program. "The hardest part wasn't the physical conditions," Danny explained, absently stroking Max's head. "It was the uncertainty, not knowing if anyone cared that I was gone or if I would ever see the outside world again. But knowing that Max was there, that he cared what happened to me, that gave me strength." Sarah listened intently as Danny described the psychological techniques he had used to survive his imprisonment. "Your journal entries showed incredible resilience. Even in your darkest moments, you never gave up hope." "I had to believe that someday the truth would come out," Danny replied. "I never imagined it would be because of Max's loyalty, but I'm grateful beyond words that he never gave up on me." Dr. Webb, who had flown to Portland to observe the reunion from a psychological perspective, was amazed by Max's behavior. The German shepherd, who had been withdrawn and stressed for months, was now the picture of contentment and fulfillment. "From a psychological standpoint, this is remarkable," Dr. Webb explained to the group. "Max has achieved what we call mission completion. His behavior for the past 6 months wasn't just loyalty or instinct, it was a form of commitment that transcended normal animal psychology." Danny looked down at Max, who was now sleeping peacefully at his feet for the first time in years. "He saved my life twice, once by keeping me company during the worst period of my imprisonment, and again by making sure the truth finally came out." The legal proceedings would take months to complete, but Danny had agreed to testify about his experiences. The evidence, uncovered through Max's vigil, would ensure that the people responsible for the corruption and illegal imprisonments would face justice. More importantly, it would prevent similar abuses from occurring in the future. "What happens now?" Sarah asked as they prepared to return to Ohio. Danny smiled, an expression that seemed to transform his entire face. "I have a decision to make. The prosecutors have offered to relocate me again after the trials are over, but I'm thinking about coming back to Ohio. I have a sister in Toledo I haven't seen in over a decade." "And Max?" Jake asked. Danny looked down at the sleeping German shepherd. "If the prison system will allow it, I'd like to adopt him when his service time is complete. I think we've both earned a peaceful retirement together." The request was approved with unprecedented speed. Warden Thompson, Attorney General Williams, and even the federal prosecutors handling the case agreed that Max had earned special consideration for his role in exposing the corruption. Arrangements were made for the dog to be retired from active duty and released to Danny's custody. 6 months later, Sarah received a letter with a Portland postmark. Inside was a photograph of Danny and Max sitting on a porch overlooking the Columbia River, both looking peaceful and content. The letter described Danny's new life as the manager of a small business, his slowly rebuilding relationship with his sister, and Max's adaptation to civilian life. Max has his own bed beside mine, the letter read, but most mornings I wake up to find him sleeping on the floor exactly where he can see the front door. Old habits die hard, I suppose. He's still watching over me, just as he did all those years at Millbrook. I think he always will. Back at Millbrook Penitentiary, Cell 47 had been permanently sealed and converted into a memorial garden visible. Through the corridor windows, a small plaque honored the courage of those who had suffered there and the loyalty of the dog who had refused to let their stories be forgotten. Jake continued working at the prison, but with a deeper appreciation for the importance of vigilance and integrity in the corrections system. Sarah had been promoted to a supervisory position where she implemented new protocols to prevent the kind of abuses that had been uncovered. The corruption trials made national headlines, resulting in significant reforms to the state corrections system and new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent future abuses. The story of Max's vigil became legendary among corrections officers across the country, a reminder that justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources. Dr. Webb published a paper about the case in the Journal of Applied Animal Psychology, documenting the extraordinary capacity for loyalty and memory that Max had demonstrated. The paper concluded that animals could serve not only as companions and workers, but as guardians of moral principles that humans sometimes abandon. Morrison served 3 years in federal prison for his role in the corruption scheme, but his cooperation and ultimate decision to save Danny's life earned him a reduced sentence. Upon his release, he dedicated his life to criminal justice reform, speaking at conferences and training sessions about the dangers of unchecked institutional power. The investigation that began with one dog's inexplicable behavior had exposed a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of state government, freed multiple victims from decades of enforced silence, and demonstrated the extraordinary power of loyalty and persistence in the pursuit of truth. Max's vigil at Cell 47 had ended, but his legacy continued. He had proven that sometimes the most important battles for justice are fought not by lawyers or investigators, but by those who simply refuse to give up on the people who need protection. His unwavering faith in Danny Brooks had ultimately saved not just one man, but had prevented countless future victims from suffering similar fates. In Portland, Oregon, Danny Brooks slept peacefully each night, knowing that somewhere nearby, Max was still keeping watch. Their bond, forged in the darkest circumstances, had ultimately brought light to a system that had tried to bury its crimes in shadow and silence. The case was closed, but the lesson remained. Justice delayed is not always justice denied, especially when there are those willing to maintain faith through the longest nights and the most difficult circumstances. Dear listeners, we hope that the incredible story of Danny Brooks and Max has moved you as much as it moved us. This tale of unwavering loyalty and the triumph of truth over corruption reminds us that justice can come from the most unexpected places, sometimes from the faithful heart of a dog who refuses to abandon someone in need. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories that explore the depths of human resilience and the bonds that transcend understanding. You can find it by clicking to your left. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity of life, love, and the courage it takes to do what's right. Don't miss our upcoming content. We look forward to seeing you in the comments. sharing how this story of loyalty and redemption has inspired you.